Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. And our story so far is that the old Bishop of Barchester died sweetly in his sleep. And the new Bishop of Barchester has been installed, and he is not the son of the old bishop. The son of the old bishop is Archdeacon Dr. Grantley, who was expecting the job and didn't get it. Instead, the job has gone to an outsider, Dr. Prouty, and his imperious bossy wife, and his oily personal chaplain, Mr. Slope. And we get a chapter describing the death of the old bishop and the breakneck race to find out whether or not Dr. Grantley is the new bishop. We get a chapter sort of following up on the events of the previous book in the Barchester series, The Warden, about the old warden of Hareham's Hospital and his daughter, Eleanor Bold, and her little baby, who's the center of her whole world. We get that chapter, I think, because when Trollope was writing that chapter, he was reflecting on the fact that the warden sold really well, or was, whether it sold really well, was enormously affectionately read. And then we get introductory chapters for both the Bishop and Mrs. Prouty and also the Reverend Slope. And then finally, Trollope gets down to business, which is where he starts to tell a story. Instead of just giving us exposition, he starts to tell a story. He gives us the meeting where old Mr. Harding and the Archdeacon go to the bishop's palace and officially meet and have conversation with. Of course, Dr. Grantley was present at the investiture of the bishop. But here they go for a social call. And they have a conversation with the bishop and with Mrs. Prouty and with Obadiah Slope. And it goes horribly, absolutely horribly. Mr. Harding, being a relatively low-level presenter at the church, is condescended to mercilessly by everybody. Mrs. Prouty is there in the room when she shouldn't be, and she's teaching theology. She's teaching scriptural responsibility to two senior churchmen who aren't accustomed to hearing that sort of thing from the women of Barchester. And on top of that, Mr. Slope has ideas of his own, not necessarily just about travel on the Sabbath or about doing things on the Sabbath day, which he likes to keep ostentatiously holy, but mainly about establishing his dominance over Barchester, which he quickly sees is not a question of establishing dominance over Mr. Harding, that it's really a question of establishing dominance over Dr. Grantley, who was, as we saw in The Warden, the power in Barchester, and recognizes a rival right away. The meeting goes horribly, absolutely horribly, and it leads to our two heroes, Dr. Grantley and Mr. Harding, are leaving the palace, and we are told that a tornado of rage is about to erupt. But we don't get that tornado in that chapter. Instead, we get it in this one. Chapter 6 is called War. And we get war on both fronts. Because keep in mind, Dr. Grantley recognizes right away that Mr. Slope is his enemy. But Mr. Slope also realizes that Dr. Grantley is his enemy. And they're both of them ready. So this is how chapter 6 goes. "Good heavens!" exclaimed the Archdeacon as he placed his foot on the gravel walk of the close, and raising his hat with one hand, passed the other somewhat violently over his now grizzled locks. Smoke issued forth from the uplifted beaver as if it were a cloud of wrath, and the safety valve of his anger opened and emitted a visible steam, preventing positive explosion and probable apoplexy. Good heavens! And the Archdeacon looked up to the gray pinnacles of the cathedral tower, making a mute appeal to that still-living witness which had looked down on the doings of so many bishops of Barchester. "I don't think I shall ever like that Mr. Slope," said Mr. Harding. "Like him!" roared the Archdeacon, standing still for a moment and giving more force to his voice. "Like him!" All the ravens of the close cawed their assent. The old bells of the tower, in chiming the hour, echoed the words, and the swallows, flying out from their nests, mutely expressed a similar opinion. Like Mr. Slope? Why, no, it was not very probable that any Barchester-bred living thing should like Mr. Slope. "Nor Mrs. Prouty either," said Mr. Harding. The Archdeacon hereupon forgot himself. I shall not follow his example, nor shock my readers by transcribing the term in which he expressed his feelings as to the lady who had been named. The ravens and the last lingering notes of the clock bells were less scrupulous, and repeated in corresponding echoes the very improper exclamation. The Archdeacon again raised his hat, and another salutary escape of steam was effected. There was a pause, during which the presenter, that is Mr. Harding, tried to realize the fact that the wife of the Bishop of Barchester had been thus designated in the close of the cathedral by the lips of its own archdeacon, and he could not do it. We're never going to know what that was, but I'd love to hear it. The bishop seems to be a quiet enough man, suggested Mr. Harding, having acknowledged to himself his own failure. Idiot! Exclaimed the doctor, who for the nonce was not capable of more than such spasmodic attempts at utterance. Well, he did not seem very bright, said Mr. Harding, and yet he has always had the reputation of a clever man. I suppose he's cautious and not inclined to express himself very freely. The new Bishop of Barchester was already so contemptible a creature in Dr. Grantley's eyes that he could not condescend to discuss his character. He was a puppet to be played by others, a mere wax doll, done up in an apron and a shovel hat, to be stuck on a throne or elsewhere and pulled about by wires as others chose. Dr. Grantley did not choose to let himself down low enough to talk about Dr. Prouty, but he saw that he would have to talk about the other members of his household, the coadjutor bishops, who had brought his lordship down, as it were, in a box, and were about to handle the wires as they willed. This in itself was a terrible vexation for the archdeacon. Could he have ignored the chaplain and fought the bishop? There would have been at any rate nothing degrading in such a contest. Let the queen make whom she would Bishop of Barchester, a man or even an ape, when once a bishop, would be a respectable adversary, if he would but fight himself. But what was such a person as Dr. Grantley to do when such another person as Mr. Slope was put forward as his antagonist? If he, our archdeacon, refused the combat, Mr. Slope would walk triumphant over the field and have the diocese of Barchester under his heel. If, on the other hand, the archdeacon accepted as his enemy the man whom the new puppet bishop put forward as such, he would have to talk about Mr. Slope and write about Mr. Slope, and in all matters treat with Mr. Slope as a being standing in some degree on similar ground to his own. He would have to meet Mr. Slope to... The idea was sickening. He could not bring himself to have to do with Mr. Slope. He is the most thoroughly bestial creature that I ever set my eyes upon, said the archdeacon. Who, the bishop? Asked the other, innocently. The bishop? No, I'm not talking about the bishop. How on earth such a creature got ordained? They'll ordain anybody I know now. But he's been in the church these 10 years, and they used to be at least a little careful 10 years ago. Oh, you mean Mr. Slope. Did you ever see any animal less like a gentleman? Said Dr. Grantley. I can't say I felt myself much disposed to like him. Like him? Again shouted the doctor, and the assenting ravens again cawed an echo. Of course you don't like him. It's not a question of liking. But what are we to do with him? Do with him? Asked Mr. Harding. Yes, what are we to do with him? How are we to treat him? There he is, and there he'll stay. He has put his foot in the palace, and he will never take it out again till he was driven. How do we get rid of him? I don't suppose he can do us much harm. Not do harm? Well, I think you'll find yourself in a different opinion about a month is gone. What would you say now if he got it himself put into the hospital? Would that be harm? Meaning Hiram's hospital, where Mr. Harding is expecting to be reinstalled as warden. Mr. Harding mused a while, and then said he did not think the bishop would put Mr. Slope into the hospital. If he doesn't put him there, he'll put him somewhere else where he'll be as bad. I tell you, that man, to all intents and purposes, will be Bishop of Barchester. Then again Dr. Grantley raised his hat and rubbed his hand thoughtfully and sadly over his head. Impudent scoundrel, he continued after a while, to dare to cross-examine me about the Sunday schools in the diocese, and Sunday traveling too. I never in my life met his equal for sheer impudence. Why, he must have thought we were two candidates for ordination. I declare I thought Mrs. Prouty was the worst of the two, said Mr. Harding. When a woman is impertinent, one must only put up with it and keep out of her way in future. But I am not inclined to put up with Mr. Slope. Travel, Sunday, Sabbath traveling. And the doctor attempted to imitate the peculiar drawl of the man he so much disliked. Sabbath traveling. Those are the sort of men who will ruin the Church of England and make the profession of a clergyman disreputable. It is not the dissenters or the papists we should fear, but the set of canting, low-bred hypocrites who are wriggling their way in among us, men who have no fixed principle, no standard ideas of religion or doctrine, who take up the popular cry as this fellow has done about Sabbath traveling. Keep in mind here what we know about Dr. Grantley. He's not exactly fond of ideological stances. We've already been told that and seen it, but he's in high dudgeon, so we won't interrupt him. Dr. Grantley did not again repeat the question aloud, but he did so constantly to himself. What were they to do with Mr. Slope? How was he openly before the world to show that he utterly disapproved of and abhorred such a man? Hitherto Barchester had escaped the taint of any extreme rigor of church doctrine. The clergymen of the city and neighborhood, though very well inclined to promote high church principles, privileges, and prerogatives, had never committed themselves to tendencies which are somewhat too loosely called Puseyite practices. Again, don't worry about things like that. Just go right by it. You know what's being said here. The specific allusions that have an asterisk and a footnote at the back, don't let them bother you. Don't let them think that you need to do research to read and love this book. You don't. Just ignore it. They all preached in their black gowns, as their fathers had done before them. They wore ordinary black waistcoats. They had no candles at their altars, either lighted or unlighted. They made no peculiar genuflections, and they were contented to confine themselves to such ceremonial observations as had been in vogue for the last 100 years. The services were decently and demurely read in their parish churches. Chanting was confined to the cathedral, and the science of intoning was unknown. One young man who had come direct from Oxford as a curate to Plumstead had, after a lapse of 2 or 3 Sundays, made a faint attempt, much to the bewilderment of the poorer part of the congregation. Dr. Grantley had not been present on the occasion, but Mrs. Grantley, who had her own opinion on the subject, immediately after the service expressed a hope that the young gentleman had not taken ill, and offered to send him all kinds of condiments supposed to be for the good of a sore throat. After that, there had been no more intoning at Plumstead Episcopi. A very subtle gesture from Mrs. Grantley. There must be something wrong with your throat. That must account for the weird noises you were making up in the altar. Reminds me of a time when I had a coworker who burst into song at my information desk. And when she was done, I said, "Are you sure you don't want to go off the sales floor and take a minute or two?" And she said, "No, why?" And I said, "Well, I assume you had an attack of stomach flu." Anyway, let's move on here. But now the Archdeacon began to meditate on some strong measures of absolute opposition. Dr. Proudie and his crew were of the lowest possible order of Church of England clergymen, and therefore it behooved him, Dr. Grantley, to be the very highest. Dr. Proudie would abolish all forms and ceremonies, and therefore Dr. Grantley felt the sudden necessity of multiplying them. Dr. Proudie would consent to deprive the Church of all collective authority and rule, and therefore Dr. Grantley would stand up for all the full powers of convocation and the renewal of all its ancient privileges. It is true that he could not himself intone the service, but he could procure the cooperation of any number of gentleman-like curates who were trained in the mystery of doing so. He would not willingly alter his own fashion of dress, but he could people Barchester with young clergymen dressed in the longest frocks and the highest-breasted silk waistcoats. He certainly could not prepare to cross himself or to advocate the real presence, but without going to this length, there were various observances by adopting which he could plainly show his antipathy to such men as Dr. Proudie and Mr. Slope. All these things passed through his mind as he paced up and down the close with Mr. Harding. War, war, internecine war was in his heart. He felt that, as regarded himself and Mr. Slope, one of the two must be annihilated as far as the city of Barchester was concerned. And he did not intend to give way until there was not left of him an inch of ground on which he could stand. He still flattered himself that he could make Barchester too hot to hold Mr. Slope. And he had no weakness of spirit to prevent his bringing about such consummation if it were in his power. "I suppose Susan must call at the palace," says Mr. Harding, referring to Dr. Grantley's wife. "Yes, she shall call there, but it shall be once and once only. I dare say the horses," remember the huge to-do that Mrs. Proudie made about the horses. I dare say the horses won't find it convenient to come out to Plumstead very soon, and when that once is done, the matter may drop. "I don't suppose Eleanor need call. I don't think Eleanor would get on at all well with Mrs. Proudie." "Not the least necessity in life," replied the Archdeacon, reflecting that a ceremony which was necessary for his wife might not at all be binding on the widow of John Bold. "Not the slightest reason on earth why she should do so if she doesn't like it. For myself, I don't think that any decent young woman should be subjected to the nuisance of being in the same room with the man." Notice he's still fixed on Mr. Slope. He's not talking about Mrs. Proudie. And so the two clergymen parted, and Mr. Harding going to his daughter's house, and the Archdeacon seeking the seclusion of his cab. The new inhabitants of the place did not express any higher opinion of their visitors than their visitors has expressed of them. Though they did not quite use the same strong language as Dr. Grantley had, they felt as much personal aversion, and were quite as well aware as he was that there should be a battle to be fought, and that there was hardly room for Prudyism in Barchester as long as Grantleyism was predominant. Indeed, it may be doubted whether Mr. Slope had not already within his breast a better prepared system of strategy, more accurately defined line of hostile conduct than the Archdeacon. Dr. Grantley was going to fight because he found he hated the man. Mr. Slope had predetermined to hate the man because he foresaw the necessity of fighting him. Very well put. Let's do that again. Dr. Grantley was going to fight because he found that he hated the man. Mr. Slope had predetermined to hate the man because he foresaw the necessity of fighting him. When he had first reviewed the lay of the land previous to his entry into Barchester, the idea had occurred to him of conciliating the Archdeacon, of cajoling and flattering him into submission, and of obtaining the upper hand by cunning instead of courage. A little inquiry, however, sufficed to convince him that all his cunning would fail to win over such a man as Dr. Grantley to such a mode of action as to be adopted by Mr. Slope, and then he determined to fall back upon his courage. He at once saw that open battle against Dr. Grantley and all Dr. Grantley's adherents was a necessity of his position, and he deliberately planned the most expedient method of giving offense. Soon after his arrival, the bishop had intimated to the dean that with the permission of the canon then in residence, his chaplain would preach in the cathedral on the next Sunday. The canon was in residence. The canon in residence happened to be the Honorable and Reverend Dr. Vesey Stanhope, who was at this moment very busy on the shores of Lake Como, adding to that unique collection of butterflies for which he is so famous. Or rather, he would have been in residence but for the butterflies and other such summer day considerations, and the vicar choral, who was to take his place in the pulpit, by no means objected to having his work done for him by Mr. Slope. Mr. Slope accordingly preached, and if a preacher can have satisfaction in being listened to, Mr. Slope ought to have been gratified. I have reason to think that he was gratified, and that he left the pulpit with the conviction that he had done what he intended to do when he entered it. On this occasion, the new bishop sat in his seat for the first time on the throne allotted him. New scarlet cushions and drapery had been prepared, with new gilt binding and new fringe. The old carved oak wood of the throne, ascending with its numerous grotesque pinnacles halfway up to the roof of the choir, is a huge thing. The bishop's sitting down here, but the woodwork just goes on and on. Had been washed and dusted and rubbed, and it all looked very smart. Ah, how often sitting there in happy earlier days on those lowly benches in front of the altar have I whiled away the tedium of a sermon in considering how best I might thread my way up amongst those wooden towers and climb safely to the topmost pinnacle. So our narrative is sat there and listened to services in Barchester Cathedral. All Barchester went to hear Mr. Slope, either for that or to gaze at the new bishop. All the best bonnets of the city were there, and moreover all the best glossy clerical hats. Not a stall but had its fitting occupant, for though some of the prebendaries might be away in Italy or elsewhere, their places were filled by brethren who flocked into Barchester on the occasion. The dean was there, a heavy old man, now too old indeed to attend frequently in his place, and so was the archdeacon. So also was the chancellor, the treasurer, the precentor, sundry canons and minor canons, and every lay member of the choir, prepared to sing the new bishop in with due melody and harmonious expression of sacred welcome. All these positions, all of them drawing their pay from the vicar isn't even at his job. He's off collecting butterflies in Lake Como on full pay. Anyway, the service was certainly well performed, such as has always been the case at Barchester, as the musical education of the choir had been good and the voices had been carefully selected. The psalms were beautifully chanted, the Te Deum was magnificently sung, and the litany was given in a manner which is still to be found in Barchester, but, if my tastes be correct, is to be found nowhere else. The litany in Barchester Cathedral has long been a special task of Mr. Harding's skill and voice had been devoted. Crowded audiences generally make good performers, and though Mr. Harding was not aware of any extraordinary exertion on his part, yet probably he rather exceeded his usual mark. Others were doing their best, and it was natural he should emulate his brethren. So the service went on, and at last Mr. Slope got into the pulpit. He chose for his text a verse from the precepts addressed by St. Paul to Timothy, as to the conduct necessary in a spiritual pastor and guide. And it was immediately evident that the good clergy of Barchester were to have a lesson. Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. These were the words of his text, and with such a subject in such a place, it may be supposed that such a preacher would be listened to by such an audience. He was listened to with breathless attention, and not without considerable surprise. Whatever opinion of Mr. Slope might have been held in Barchester before he commenced his discourse, none of his hearers, when it was over, could mistake him either for a fool or for a coward. It would not be becoming were I to travesty a sermon, or even to repeat the language of it in the pages of a novel. In endeavoring to depict the characters of the person of whom I write, I am to a certain extent forced to speak of sacred things. I trust, however, that I shall not be thought to scoff at the pulpit, though some may imagine that I do not feel at all the reverence which is due to the cloth. A little bit late for that now, Tony. I may question the infallibility of the teachers, but I hope that I shall not therefore be accused of doubt as to the thing being taught. Mr. Slope, in commencing his sermon, showed no slight tact in his ambiguous manner of hinting that, humble as he was himself, he stood there as the mouthpiece of the illustrious divine who sat opposite to him, and having premised so much, he gave forth a very accurate definition of the conduct which that prelate would rejoice to see in the clergyman now brought under his jurisdiction. It is only necessary to say that the peculiar points insisted on were exactly those which were most distasteful to the clergy of the diocese, most averse to their practices and opinions, and that all the peculiar habits and privileges which have always been dear to high church priests, to that party which is now scandalously called the high and dry church, were ridiculed, abused, and anathematized. Now the clergy of the Diocese of Barchester were all the high and dry church. Having thus, according to his own opinion, explained how a clergyman should show himself approved unto God as a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, he went on to explain how the word of truth should be divided, and here he took a rather narrow view of the question, and fetched his arguments from afar. His object was to express his abomination of all ceremonious modes of utterance, to cry down any religious feeling which might be excited, not by the sense, but by the sounds of the words. In fact, to insult cathedral practices. Had St. Paul spoken of rightly pronouncing instead of rightly dividing the word of truth, this part of his sermon would have been more to the purpose. But the preacher's immediate object was to preach Mr. Slope's doctrine, not St. Paul's, and he contrived to give the necessary twist to the text with some skill. He could not exactly say, preaching from a cathedral pulpit, that chanting should be abandoned in cathedral services. By such an assertion, he would have overshot his mark and rendered himself absurd, to the delight of his hearers. He could, however, and did, allude with heavy denunciations to the practice of intoning in parish churches, although the practice was all but unknown in the diocese, and from thence he came round to the undue preponderance which he asserted music had over meaning in the beautiful service which they had just heard. He was aware, he said, that the practices of our ancestors could not be abandoned at a moment's notice. The feeling of the aged would be outraged, and the minds of respectable men would be shocked. There were many, he was aware, of not sufficient caliber of thought to perceive, of not sufficient education to know, that a mode of service which was effective when outward ceremonies were of more moment than inward feelings had become all but barbarous at a time when inward conviction was everything, when each word of a minister's lips should fall unintelligibly into the listener's heart. Formerly, the religion of the multitude had been an affair of the imagination. Now, in these latter days, it had become necessary that a Christian should have a reason for his faith, should not only believe but digest, not only hear but understand. The words of our morning service, how beautiful, how apposite, how intelligible they were, when read with simple and distinct decorum. But how much of the meaning of the words was lost when they were produced with the meretricious charms of melody, etc., etc. Here was a sermon to be preached before Mr. Archdeacon Grantley, Mr. Precentor Harding, and the rest of them. Before a whole dean and chapter assembled in their own cathedral, before men who had grown old in the exercise of their peculiar services with a full conviction of their excellence for all intended purposes. This too from such a man, a clerical parvenu, a man without a cure, a mere chaplain, an intruder among them, a fellow raked up, so Dr. Grantley said, from the gutters. They had to sit through it. None of them, not even Dr. Grantley, could close his ears, nor leave the house of God during the hours of service. They were under an obligation of listening, and that too without any immediate power of reply. Here, Trollope wants to expand a little on how horrible it is to have to sit there and listen to a sermon. He's not going to let it go. He doesn't like it himself. There is perhaps no greater hardship at present inflicted on mankind in civilized and free countries than the necessity of listening to sermons. I should think conscription would probably count, but I'll let it go. No one but a preaching clergyman has in these realms the power of compelling an audience to sit silent and be tormented. No one but a preaching clergyman can revel in platitudes, truisms, and untruisms, and yet receive as his undisputed privilege the same respectful demeanor as though the words of impassioned eloquence or persuasive logic fell from his lips. Let a professor of law or physic find his place in the lecture room and there pour forth jejune and useless empty phrases, and he will pour them forth to empty benches. Let a barrister attempt to talk without talking well, and he will talk but seldom. A judge's charge needs to be listened to perforce by none but the jury, the prisoner, and the jailer. A member of parliament can be coughed down or counted out. Town councillors can be tabooed, but no one can rid himself of a preaching clergyman. He is the bore of the age, the old man whom we Sinbads cannot shake off, the nightmare that disturbs our Sunday's rest, the incubus that overloads our religion and makes God's service distasteful. We are not forced into church, no, but we desire more than that. We desire not to be forced to stay. We desire, nay, we are resolute to enjoy the comfort of public worship. But we desire also that we may do so without an amount of tedium which an ordinary human nature cannot endure with patience, that we may be able to leave the house of God without that anxious longing for escape, which is the common consequence of common sermons. With what complacency will a young parson deduce false conclusions from his misunderstood text, then threaten us all with the penalties of Hades if we neglect to comply with the injunction he's given us? Yes, my too self-confident juvenile friend, I do believe in those mysteries, which are so common in your mouth. I do believe in the unadulterated word, which you hold there in your hand, but you must pardon me if in some things I doubt your interpretation. Here he's addressing himself directly to those young preaching sermons. The Bible is good, the prayer book is good, nay, you yourself would be acceptable if you would read to me some portion of those time-honored discourses without our great divines having elaborated in full maturity of their powers. But you must excuse me, my insufficient young lecturer, if I yawn over your imperfect sentences, your repeated phrases, your false pathos, your drawlings and denunciations, your humming and hawing, your ohing and ahhing, your black gloves and your white handkerchief. To me, it all means nothing. An hour is too precious to be wasted, if only we could avoid it. And here I must make a protest against the pretense so often put forward by the working clergy that they are overburdened by the multitude of sermons to be preached. We are all too fond of our own voices, and a preacher is encouraged in the vanity of making his heard by the privilege of a compelled audience. His sermon is the pleasant morsel of his life, his delicious moment of self-exaltation. I have preached 9 sermons this week, said a young friend to me the other day with a hand languidly raised to his brow, the picture of an overburdened martyr. 9 this week, 7 last week, 4 the week before. I've preached 23 sermons this month. It's really too much. Too much indeed, said I, shuddering. Too much for the strength of anyone. Yes, he answered meekly, indeed it is. I'm beginning to feel it painfully. Would, I said, you could feel it. Would that you could be made to feel it. But he never guessed that my heart was wrung for the poor listeners. In other words, in the conversation, he's faking like he's sympathizing with this preaching clergyman. There was, at any rate, no tedium felt in listening to Mr. Slope on the occasion in question. His subject came too home to his audience to be dull, and to tell the truth, Mr. Slope had the gift of using words forcibly. He was heard through his 30 minutes of eloquence with mute attention and open ears, but with angry eyes, which glared round from one enraged person to another, with widespread nostrils from which already burst fumes of indignation, and with many shufflings of feet and uneasy motions of the body, which betokened minds disturbed and hearts not at all at peace with the world. At last the bishop, who of all the congregation had been the most surprised, and whose hair almost stood on end with terror, gave the blessing in a manner not at all equal to that which he had long been practicing it at his study, and the congregation was free to go their way. That is the chapter War, and we can see that things are already brought neatly to a head. Now, a couple of points we want to make here. We've commented before in Barchester Tower that this was done serialized first, and you can tell that because the point of this chapter is to lay out the standpoint of the two sides in the war. And there's a more effective way to do that than is done in this chapter. We get a lot of what Dr. Grantley thinks about Mr. Slope, but we don't get Mr. Slope's sermon. And this is a novel that is steadily about the business of mocking the clergy. So the narrator's, slightly dimple-faced excuse that he can't give you the text of the sermon because that would be sacrilegious somehow is ridiculous. We should have heard it. Instead, we are not hearing it. Instead, we are seeing the reactions that it produces in its listeners. And that's uneven. We have far more explicit terminology for where Mr. Grantley's war is than where Mr. Slope's war is. And I wish that could be different. And also from the structure of the chapter, you can see the periodical serialization. Because Trollope tells us that Mr. Slope gets up to the lectern and delivers a sermon to the people of Barchester that they're not likely to forget in all their born days. An open attack on the service that was just provided and on the clergy of Barchester. An open attack on everything that everyone there knows and loves. In other words, the long digression that we get, a whole page of text about how boring some church sermons can be, is totally beside the point. Trollope's narrator says it himself, that certainly didn't apply here. So why did we get that? Why did we get all of that? It's Trollope not only padding his chapter for page length, but also indulging himself in some of the axes that he has to grind against church services in England of his day. He has a lot of them. They crop up all through his novels, including all through this series. But it's undisciplined. It's workmanlike because, you know, he's got to fill his pages for that quota. But it doesn't work in the chapter, I don't think. Why have a long digression about how tedious some church sermons can be if the sermon we're talking about is anything but? Better to use that space to give us the sermon rather than this long digression about what it's not. I have to think, I always, when I read this chapter, I always have to imagine the scene all over England when this novel was being serialized. It was wildly popular. Imagine imagine that you're, you know, a priest in some small village. Everybody there has had the latest. They've all one of them maybe or two buy the latest magazine when this appears, and it makes the rounds of the whole village. People can't wait for someone to be done with that now very dog-eared copy of the magazine so they can read the latest installment about, oh, that horrible Mr. Slope. Imagine that happening in your village, and then you give your service on Sunday. And it's not the cathedral town of Barchester. It's your local church where people feel comfortable talking to you. They feel comfortable talking to the head of the parish. How many people brought up these chapters? How many people brought up that these preaching clergymen feel free to speak both truisms and untruisms? How many of them did that? Some of the people in those local churches were probably local grandees. They probably contributed quite a bit of money to the church, and in recompense felt that they had the right to speak familiarly with their own preaching clergyman. I wonder how many clergymen's life was made a little harder for a few Sundays by this chapter. I'd love to know about that. I don't know. Probably some of them kept memoirs or wrote letters. Probably there is a way to learn that, but I've never read about it. But anyway, that's chapter 6 of Barchester Tower, Wars. Barchester Towers, this is war. And now war has been declared. Dr. Grantley is determined to eradicate Mr. Slope. He has realized that there is no way for us to live together. There can only be one of us in Barchester. And Mr. Slope has fired a shot across the bow that this is not the way we're going to do things here for our church services. The only thing that you are missing so far in this novel is a secular plot. This is turf infighting in a cathedral town, in the cathedral, in the clerical ranks, which is great for a novel. Trollope's fantastic at it, but you know he's not going to stick to that. So we're going to keep going. I will wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.